newspaper is far from what, I would have been capable of doing, but that's what he was doing. And that was kind of when he got enamored with the Free State movement, which was the movement to make Kansas a free state. And at that point, he starts becoming involved. He travels to Kansas and starts writing basically as a newspaper correspondent to his own paper, sending letters back of, here's what I'm experiencing, which I put all of those in the book. And he started smuggling weapons into Kansas for the Free State movement. So he's 18 years old, leading a group of men smuggling weapons where if he'd been caught, he would have been killed.
Yeah.
He does that, and then after he gets to Kansas, he decides, I'm going to make this my home. He gets involved with the Emporia Town Company in 1857 and founds the town of Emporia, Kansas. At that time, he's 19.
Right.
So he starts his own newspaper in Emporia. He's still working with the Free State movement. He's helping escape slaves with John Brown. He's knowing who's who of the Kansas territory.
Right.
He's part of the one of the constitutional conventions for the state of Kansas in 1858. He puts himself through college again to become a lawyer and gets elected to the state legislature in Kansas. And so he's a state representative in 1861, and he's 23.
23. So let me interrupt you real quick. So, hold on real quick. It looks like. All right. So, no, I was just making sure. It said we had some feedback going on. Those of you on, do you have any feedback or any audio issues? Let me know if you have by typing in there. Says it's going good so far. So, all right. So, real quick, those of you who are just joining us, I want to introduce. Looks like we had a live stream glitch there, but we have. There we go. All right. So, introduce Miss Joanna Wickman again, because the live stream apparently glitched out and I had to start it over again.
Oh, no.
So, basically, the life. Let's see, there we go. Not life letters. Wow, I'm all over.
There are letters in it.
There are letters in it. So, basically, Miss Joanna Wickman, which you've been listening to for the past couple minutes here, says The Forgotten Senator, the life and character of Preston Plumb, the book that we're interviewing her on right now. And she's talking to us about just the life that he had. So kind of pick up where you left off there as far as he's 23 and he's already done all this, right?
Right.
So after that, what does he do?
So after he gets into the state legislature, this of course is when the Civil War is broken out. And he wants to enlist, but he stays in the legislature so he can help get the county boundaries defined in Kansas so that Emporia can be the county seat for, now it's Lyon County, that time it was Breckinridge County. And in the fall of 1862, he's serving as a Supreme Court reporter for the state Supreme Court with his law firm. That's where he meets Thomas Ewing, who he will go on to serve with in the military. And he starts recruiting a company of men for the war. And so he ends up recruiting Company C of the 11th Kansas, at that time infantry, and musters into service in September of 1862. And so during the war, he serves in Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas. They're converted to a cavalry regiment, and they come out west to Wyoming, which is how I initially encountered him while doing research for my thesis. They serve out here. They're discharged in fall of 1865. I'm going through this real fast.
No, I was gonna say,
there's a lot of things that happened in the war, but we're gonna keep going.
Yeah.
He's discharged in fall of 1865. He gets married in 1867, starts a family. He's back in the state legislature at that time. He's Speaker of the House. He's also running his law firm again. And in 1877, he runs for the U.S. Senate. And he's also, at that time, serving as president of the Emporia National Bank.
Right.
He's a bank president, lawyer. Now he's a U.S. senator in 1877. He quickly rises through the ranks as a Republican senator. In those days, and it might still be somewhat the same today, when you were elected to the Senate, you were expected for the first couple of years to just kind of sit back and, learn your way around things. But like I said before, that wasn't his personality. So he goes into the Senate, and almost from day one, he's got his bills that he wants to introduce. He's doing all sorts of things. His first bill that he introduced, every single senator voted against it, but him, just as kind of an effort to put him in his place. There was another bill that came up shortly after that where he was the only one who voted against it. He had the party, but he would stray from the Republican Party if he didn't agree with what was going on. And that attitude really just propelled him through politics. He found himself on the Committee of Public Lands pretty quickly and became chairman of that committee, which is one of the most powerful Senate committees you can be on, because at that time we're having westward expansion, the railroads are building, across the West, and he was in charge of the committee that laid all of that out and approved those land grants. He also introduced a bill to create the Department of Agriculture as a separate federal department. It had existed prior to that, but was not under its own department, so we still have that today. He also championed a lot of conservation laws, which were forestry laws at that time, which have evolved now into our time as the U.S. Forest Service. So he was involved in a number of things, and also especially military issues. So anytime anything relating to the military came up into the Senate, he always had an opinion on that. He also championed pension requests. At the time of his death in 1891, there were 6,000 outstanding pension requests that he had put through, just himself. To put that in perspective, any given year in the Senate, and I looked this up because I wanted to see, was he really that productive? Most senators would put through, hundreds. That was a lot of bills, 100 bills, a session. He was doing hundreds, 300-400, just all different sorts of things. He just continuously worked. And he passed away in 1891 very suddenly.
I guess suddenly by what, do we know?
He had a stroke. He had been having a series of small strokes, and then on December 20th, 1891, he had basically a massive stroke. And a lot of the doctors surmised that was because he was not taking care of himself. He was basically worked himself to death. He would sometimes go days without eating. He was too busy working. He'd take, one meal and then just keep going. He ran off 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and it just caught up with him.
Yeah, that's crazy. So I guess the question I always ask then is what drew you to him? Like, why do a book about a guy in Kansas and you live in Wyoming?
Right. Like I mentioned, I found him when I was doing my research for my master's thesis. And I was really surprised that I couldn't find much information about him. And so I mentioned that book from 1913, the only book on him. And I ordered that and I read it, and it was, in all fairness to Connolly, like I said, it didn't age well. It's a tough read. Yeah. But the information that was in it, I found very interesting, because there were a lot of stories about how impactful he was through not only his service out here in Wyoming, through Kansas, but even nationally. And I was surprised that someone like that was out here and we didn't have, he's not talked about. Some people knew, but it wasn't common knowledge. And so the more I started to dig into his story, the more significant he became to me. And I was really surprised that this character who had done so much and was so selfless had just been lost, and it happens. When you work in history, people fall through the cracks. But his story to me was just so fascinating. You have the military service, which is interesting, but you have, him smuggling guns as a teenager into Kansas, and at one point when they were smuggling guns, they were stopped at Fort Riley by the sutler who tried to disarm him. And, Plumb's 18 years old. And the settler says, you need to give me your gun. And he says, Plumb says, you can't have my gun, but you can have the contents of it. You know? I mean, like that kind of threatening, I mean, he was a tough guy. And very strong sense of justice, what was right, what was wrong, followed things to the letter, but would bend rules if he had to, if he felt that was how things should be done. It's just a really interesting person. And the more stories I started to read, the more I went down the rabbit hole, I guess you could say.
Yeah, so I guess one question I have is, like, when you were doing the research, I mean, obviously, we've been talking back and forth a little bit. It's been an adventure over the past few years. Kind of tell us about the start of writing this book after your thesis and just the adventure that ensued after.
So when I first found him, I thought, when I read Connolly's book, I thought, wow, this guy really needs a modern, up-to-date biography. And that thought had always been there, and it just kind of went into the back burner in the back of my mind. And so I finished my thesis. I get my master's degree in 2014, and Plumb is still there, kind of in the back of my mind. And in 2017, I applied for some grants from the Wyoming State Historical Society and the Kansas State Historical Society. And for those grants, I was doing research on the 11th Kansas and their time in Fort Halleck. And I was also kind of using that as basically a way to test the waters. How much information is there on this guy in Kansas? Is a book even feasible? Because there are some people that have good stories, but if they've already all been printed, all I'm doing is rehashing something that already exists, and I didn't want to do that. And so in 2017, in the fall, I went down there, and the research that I thought was going to be in Topeka was actually in Emporia, which is how I got connected with the museum there. And while I was down there, I ended up having the opportunity to visit his house in Emporia, which was very cool, which still had a number of his things in it. I go back home, and I was really kind of disappointed. I didn't have the information I needed to write the article, but I knew that there was a treasure trove of information in Emporia, because that's where all of Connolly's notes from his biography were. And I mean treasure trove. Yeah. We're talking file boxes upon file boxes upon file boxes of interviews, all kinds of Plumb family documents. And so I thought, I need to go back there and work on this book. And that kind of, again, went to the back burner. And then in late 2020, in December of 2020, I kind of resurrected this idea. I thought, I'm going to write that book. I'm in a spot now where I could do that. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but I thought I can do this, And so about that same time is when I discovered that his house in Emporia, which had been a women's shelter for 99 years, was going to be basically sold and the contents of the house liquidated. And I thought, oh no, because there's a bunch of stuff in there. And so I went down to Emporia in February of 2021. I went through the house and identified a lot of original books and documents, which were since saved and are now at the Lyon County History Center in Emporia. And while I was down there, I started actually looking through some of those boxes of papers that they had. And I thought, okay, this is the source material for my book. There's a lot of other information out there, but Connolly's original interviews are the guts of this book. And when I went back in the fall of 2021, I digitized everything. And I mean everything. I don't even know how many files it is. On my computer right now, I have over 50,000 Plumb files. So, and those, and each time I scan a page of something, it's a file. But probably a good, 15, 20,000 pages of material I scanned. And when I say Connolly's interviews, so when Connolly wrote his book, it came out in 1913. 1910, he was hired by the Plumb family to write this biography. And he traveled around Kansas, he traveled to Washington, D.C., and he interviewed everyone he could get his hand on that knew Plumb, that knew him in the war, that knew him as a senator, that knew him when he founded the town, that knew him when he just started his first newspaper in Ohio. I mean, everyone. And he took all of these stories down verbatim. And when he wrote his book, he summarized a lot of them. Most of the stories didn't even make it into the book. And so they were just not used. Wow. And so when I went down there, I'm scanning all, like, this is gold. And I'm just turning pages, scanning, this is great. And so I took all of the stuff back home, read through all of it, and then sorted it. This is the military stories. These are the Senate stories. And there's overlap between those. There's guys that, one of the guys that went with him, Captain Pierce, when he smuggled guns into Kansas, actually served with him in the 11th Kansas and was a friend after the war. There's a lot of these time frames overlap. But there was a tremendous amount of information. And so it took me months and basically another year to just sort through all of that and then kind of arrange it so that it would make sense. And then when I started writing the book, I started to write a typical biography, kind of what I learned in grad school. And so I'm using these stories as this is what happened. And I started writing it, and I didn't like it. And I couldn't figure out why I didn't like it, because I loved reading the stories. And when I would read it in what I had written in the book, I didn't like it. And then it was like the light bulb came on. It's because I paraphrased it. And so I went back and I did
that's what Connolly did as well, right?
That is exactly what Connolly did. And that's typically what you'll find in an academic biography. They'll find interviews, letters, and they kind of cherry pick, some key data points out of it. And then the rest of the book is kind of their theory or synopsis of those things. And consequently, a lot of those books can be rather dry. And so I loved reading these stories of these adventures and things. And I thought, well, this is a little unorthodox. I'm just going to put those in my book as they were told, right. And so basically this book, it's a biography, but it reads like a narrative history in that it's the story of his life as told by those who knew him. It's primarily other stories told by people who experienced these things with him, who were with him in the war.
Real quick, I'll show this to the audience here. So we have the actual cover, if you guys can see that. Again, it says, The Forgotten Senator, The Life and Character of Preston Plums. And on the left-hand column, you actually have, As Told by Those Who Know Him. And I think that, just going to what you were said, that's really what sets your book apart, is it's not necessarily an academic book that people expect from like a historical academic standpoint. It's actually just people's comments and thoughts and memories of him.
Right, and it's all connected. It's all researched. It's all cited, just like any academic book would be. But instead of me paraphrasing somebody's diary entry of the Battle of Prairie Grove, I put the whole diary entry in there, so you can read it for yourself. In my mind, when you're reading about something like that, like in one example, there was the skirmish out here in June of 1865, and Plumb wrote a whole report about what happened in that fight. That's in there. I would rather you read it from Plumb than read it from me who read it from Plumb. You know what I'm saying? It starts to become like a game like telephone, and you start summarizing things and you can leave out key details. And so for that reason, my job, I felt as the author, was basically to connect these stories, so put them in context, and to then emphasize the significance of some of these things as they're mentioned. Like one example, the Battle of Westport. Plumb led a dismounted cavalry charge uphill into Confederate lines.
So actually,
while they're behind a stone fence.
Let's talk about that then. Let's start with, obviously given our audience with our YouTube channel, let's kind of start with his military career. So you kind of really quickly in the synopsis, when we started, went, hey,
super quick, yeah.
But start from basically when the unit was organized. Obviously, it was organized as an infantry unit originally, right, and cavalry. So let's just kind of come back and then talk about his military experience.
Sure. So like I mentioned before, he helped recruit Company C, and he was at that time a recruiting lieutenant. Then he was promoted to captain within a couple days of that, and then a couple days of that, he was elected major in the regiment. And so their first battle was the Battle of Prairie Grove, which is December 7th, 1862. And this is kind of a big deal because number one, it's their first battle, but it's also a big deal for Plumb because although he had been exposed to, I'll say, some kind of combat through smuggling guns, and as a militia member, this was, a first big battle. And this is happening at the same time that he starts their regimental newspaper called the Buck and Ball. And the regimental newspaper was done by him, some other printers, Edmund Ross, another Kansas senator, was also a part of that. He was part of the 11th Kansas. And they started printing this newspaper on December 6th. And so they found this printing press that had been used to print Bibles for the Cherokee. So it was a combination of English letters and Cherokee type. And so the press had been kind of dismantled, destroyed a little bit. So they had to put it back together, get it operational. They start running this newspaper, and they print the first side. Well, then December 7th, the Battle of Prairie Grove happens, so they can't finish printing it. So Plumb actually takes, the half-printed newspapers, rolls them up, throws them in the back of an army ambulance as it's going by, because the guys are scattering because battle's starting. They got to go different places. And so Battle of Prairie Grove happens. The next day, they're dealing with the wounded and casualties and things. The day after that, he goes back to his printing press, which has been destroyed, puts it back together again, and they actually print the second half of the newspaper. So if you look at the Buck and Ball newspaper, it's dated one date, but the articles are actually from two different dates. But in this newspaper, they actually sum up the entire Battle of Prairie Grove. Plumb wrote some great articles that are in it. And that's something I also included in the book in its entirety. Here is the Buck and Ball. A lot of people have been asking to read that. There were not very many copies of it made. They were using whatever paper they could find, whatever blanks. Some of them they were using wallpaper. It's like whatever you can print on. Yeah. And Ewing and Blunt really liked the newspaper. They liked the idea of a regimental newspaper. And then General Schofield took command, and he didn't like the idea of a regimental newspaper. And so the Buck and Ball consisted of one issue, one volume. That's it.
So one issue, one volume.
There was one copy, and that was it.
Right. So I guess, so why was it called Buck and Ball then?
So the Buck and Ball was after the type of weaponry they carried. So like we mentioned before, they were an infantry unit, but instead of having Springfield or Enfield, they were issued these antiquated Prussian muskets that fired a Buck and Ball charge. So it's actually one musket ball and then 3 smaller buckshot.
Yeah, so, which is funny because, obviously on my end, being interested in the military side of things, you generally consider Buck and Ball more of a, like you said, antiquated, and even maybe more so on the Confederate side of things as far as ammunition. And obviously you have a frontline infantry/cavalry unit being issued this antiquated rifle with, musket with Buck and Ball. And that's what these guys were issued.
Yeah, and it was funny because Ewing had joked that maybe they should be reclassified as light artillery, considering they had these. And Plumb had mentioned years later that, whenever they were out for target practice, the other regiments would move to the next county over just to be safe, because they had a lot of issues with those. But they only had those for a few months. Then they did finally get issued Springfields and Enfields. Another great story that I've got in there with the regiment. So after Prairie Grove, the regiment really gets stuck fighting bushwhackers for a lot of time. Now, bushwhackers, for lack of a better way, I describe in the book, essentially it's guerrilla warfare. And it's not unlike what U.S. troops experienced in Vietnam, obviously minus the jungles, but you'll be coming along, you'll be going through a forest, and bushwhackers can come out of nowhere and attack you. And so one of the things that the 11th Kansas did was they broke the regiment into smaller teams, and they worked with other regiments. So they worked with Missouri regiments, Iowa, and they would actually go out, split up. Basically what the Army does now in Iraq and Afghanistan, where they would use regimental combat teams, 10-man teams, and you would pick different people based on what their skill sets were, and you would all go in different directions, which is kind of unique, because most people, when you think Civil War combat, you think one army marching this way and the army marching this way, which they did do that, but when they're fighting the bushwhackers, it's very different. It's a different type of combat. There are some stories in there about them capturing bushwhackers, interrogating them, executing them, going through homes, searching, to see if there were bushwhackers hidden in the homes, which one of my dear friends who's an Iraq combat vet immediately identified with that. He's like, this is what I did in Iraq, and so those kinds of stories were great. He was also involved in the pursuit of Quantrill. So I don't know if you want to go into this. Okay,
go ahead.
Because I can just ramble. So
no, this is a good story as well. So no, go ahead for sure.
So in August of 1863, William Clark Quantrill, who's probably one of the most famous bushwhackers, as they called them, border ruffians. I love ruffian. Nobody uses that word anymore. One of the most famous ones rides into Lawrence, Kansas, and sacks the town. At that time, Plumb is essentially in command of the 11th Kansas. Ewing had gone home to visit his wife and left the area. And so Plumb is in charge of now trying to pursue Quantrill and hopefully catch him. And this story has been, I don't want to say convoluted, but misconstrued, I would say, over the years. There are a lot of people in Lawrence who felt Plumb didn't do what he should have done in chasing Quantrill. And when I was doing my research for the book, I found a lot of firsthand accounts from other 11th Kansas soldiers describing this pursuit. And it really clears up a lot of that. So one of the main things was that Quantrill comes and attacks Lawrence. No one really knows which direction he went. Plumb is getting conflicting reports. Oh, he went east. He went west. He went down the river. And so Plumb has a small number of men that he's trying to determine which direction they went. So he sets off in one direction, which unfortunately was the wrong direction. So now Quantrill's going the opposite direction, putting more distance between them. So then he has to turn around and go the other way. And this whole time, he's sending dispatches back to Ewing asking for reinforcements, because he's only got about 130 guys with him. Quantrill's band is in the hundreds, 300 to 400 men. So they also think if he had caught up to him, it probably wouldn't have turned out too well for the 11th Kansas anyway. But they end up riding all night. Plumb's horse ran until it collapsed. His brother George was with him and got him a new horse. He picked up on that horse and kept going. So they ran all night. They spent 24 hours in a saddle, no food, no breaks. They chased them until their horses literally collapsed or died. Some of the men collapsed and died on the pursuit. And so I put all of this in there because I feel like Plumb has gotten a really bad rap for that. Why didn't you catch him? Well, he can only go with the information he's got at the time. If one information is saying he went east and he goes east, but it turns out he went west, then he loses valuable time. And, it's not like now where you can just get in your car and drive somewhere. You're at the mercy of your horse. If your horse is collapsed, you're stuck. Yeah. And so that was actually, a really interesting story to find out. Another story that's in here that I don't think most people are aware of, I mentioned Plumb's brother George. So George was not in the 11th Kansas. He was in a different regiment. He was on detached duty with the 11th. He was serving as a scout. And when we talk about Quantrill, we also talk about good old Bloody Bill Anderson. Now, Bloody Bill was another bushwhacker. His sister, Molly, was basically a spy for them. And a lot of people have heard the infamous prison collapse story where they were housing the women, the prison collapsed. Well, what most people probably don't know is that Plumb and his brother George are the reason that Molly was arrested to begin with. She'd actually come to, quote, visit some friends who had been captured. And so Plumb gave her a pass to go visit, look for relatives, that kind of thing. Well, really, that was just a pretext to go in there and gather intel. And since Plumb was suspicious about her, he asked his brother George, he said, George, go see what this lady's doing. I don't trust her. So George went and found her and basically was like, nah, this isn't legit. You're not doing, what you're supposed to be doing. By the time he finds her, she's in a wagon on her way back into town. She's left. And George is like, no, you're coming back. You're coming back to headquarters. And so George dragged her back, and then George and Plumb interrogated her, and that's how she got arrested. So they were both involved in that. Most people, I think, just know the story of her being arrested, but don't realize that both Plumb and his brother were involved in that, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely
and
not.
that story is in the book as told by George. So George sat down and gave an interview with Connolly and described, here's what I did. I rode this far. I did this. I talked to so-and-so. And so, again, another one of those, I'm just going to put it in there.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is a great piece of information for people researching Bleeding Kansas and, stuff like that.
Well, actually, so I guess the other question I have is, what was his thought of Kansas before the war? I mean, obviously you have Bleeding Kansas. How was he more? Because you told me some stories beforehand of how he was involved before the war even started, as far as like you said, smuggling some guns. Is there anything or any story regarding right before the war started or Bleeding Kansas that you want to add in there or throw in?
Well, yeah, I mentioned the smuggling guns. Once he founded Emporia in 1857, then he became a lawyer. And while he was a lawyer, he was also, I don't know where to put it, very high up within the community. People who had questions about things went to Plumb. And he kind of organized a lot of things. So Emporia had their own militia, which he was involved with, and he was an officer within that, patrolling the town against an invasion from border ruffians, people like Quantrill, Bloody Bill. He also served with Jim Lane, who was one of Kansas's more infamous senators. But he did work with Jim Lane's militia. He also would work occasionally with John Brown. John Brown, everyone knows John Brown from Harper's Ferry. He was obviously a lot more militaristic in ways than Plumb. At that time in Bleeding Kansas, you've got pro-slavery people coming into Kansas, burning towns, killing people, and you've got free state abolitionists going into Missouri doing the same thing. I mean, it's just kind of this constant tit for tat, which John Brown was involved in from the abolitionist perspective. Plumb was never involved in those sorts of things. He didn't agree with that, but he did agree with helping escape slaves. And so to that end, he would sometimes partner with John Brown. So there's a story in there where John Brown had rescued some slaves and they needed passage further north. And so Plumb was the one that went to the cabin, picked up the slaves, and got them north. At the same time, there's another great story of an escaped slave who had come north from Texas and was moving his way through Kansas, just trying, to get north. And he stole a horse near Emporia. And so he got arrested for stealing the horse. And so the town people of Emporia raised enough money. They hired Plumb to defend him. And this was actually a pretty big deal at the time because it was cut and dried. This man stole the horse. He was guilty of that. But during the trial, Plumb was able to argue, the reasons why he stole the horse, and also there was a technicality on how the man was arrested, which then basically caused a mistrial. And so then Plumb and some others arranged to move the man further north before they could get the paperwork together to rearrest him and file the charges properly. So he was doing things like that. When he was in the state legislature, he was involved with the Kansas State Normal School, which is now a university there. He's the one that got that situated there instead of going into another town. He was part of the 1858 Kansas Constitutional Convention, which Kansas was going through different constitutions, and the people would vote on him, and then it would get submitted to the U.S. Senate, and it would get vetoed, which the 1858 one was that he was a part of. But in that Constitution, the voting record still survives. So for that, he was for women's suffrage, and that he was voted down on, but by the other members of the convention, but he was for it. And then he was also for suffrage for African Americans as well, which that did survive in the Constitution, but then it wasn't approved by the Senate. So.
That's awesome. So, again, we're quickly running out of time. So before we talk about the closing side of things. You brought some artifacts that I would love to show the audience this. We took some screenshots of it, so we'll show that. So out of the three options here, what do you want to talk about first, or as far as your story of how these came into your possession?
Well, we can start with the shadow box if you want, since
Yeah,
we were just talking about military stuff. In this shadow box of items, these are all items that were given to me by members of the Plumb family. So as I was doing my research for this book, I ended up connecting with the family, which was literally through a cold call on Ancestry, emailing them, "Hi, I'm writing a book on your, great-great-grandfather. I'm looking for information." And out of that came this incredible friendship with the family, which has just been amazing to me. And they were kind enough to give me these things. And so the first medal that's there on the left is a Knights Templar medal that belonged to him. Plumb was the first Mason in Emporia, Freemason, and was a member his whole life. And so that's what that is. The badge there, that's the moon and the star, that's his 7th Corps insignia. And I'm looking at it upside down, so I'm like, to the right of that is his GAR membership lapel button. And below that, these are actually his lieutenant colonel shoulder straps, which is very cool. And then to the right of that is a GAR ribbon, medal. The ribbon has been replaced. That's a modern ribbon, but the medal is original. And the last ribbon is from the Board of Trade, and that's actually a funeral ribbon. So after he passed, the Kansas Board of Trade printed this kind of commemorative ribbon because he was so popular. I didn't mention it before, but when he died, just to give you an idea of how popular this man was, 15,000 mourners showed up in Topeka, Kansas, just to view the funeral parade and his body while it laid in state. That's kind of unheard of. After the body left Topeka, it went to Emporia, where another 3,000 mourners went by.
Well, and that's one thing I think is important about your book that you've done, and like I said, the whole adventure you have had in writing this thing, is that you had 15,000 people in Topeka. Yeah, well, you said 3,000 people in Peoria.
In Emporia.
Sorry.
And then there was also a service forum in Washington where the president, the vice president, lots of people came to that as well.
You had all these people doing that and coming and mourning him. And yet when you started going to the either state archives or local museums or whatever, you were surprised on how many people just had no idea of him. It was that Plumb was the name of a street or a memorial building or something like that. They didn't really know his story.
Yeah, a lot of the significance had been lost. In Emporia, obviously they knew he was a town founder. They knew important things about him, but a lot of these details, as far as specific things he did, specific Senate bills, specific battles he was in, the really filling in the story, that had been just lost to time. And the further away you get from Emporia, the less recognized he is. Yeah. I talked to some folks in Emporia, not at the museum, but some other folks there, and was asking about him. And then, I would get, oh yeah, there's that building on the college campus that's Plumb Hall, or yeah, that Plumb. But what he had done was just lost. Yeah. And yet at the time, he was a leading member of the Republican Party. He was so well known. I mean, he was the subject of Thomas Nast cartoons. He was, in every national newspaper, I mean, it wasn't like when he passed, only Kansas knew about it. It was something that registered on a national level. And to have someone that significant to kind of be dropped down to like, well, I think he founded the town and that's his name on the building. It just, it was just such a discrepancy.
So let's go ahead and go to the script, right? They're not scripted.
This is the magazine.
The magazine, sorry, yeah.
So yeah, the magazine is super cool. This also came from the family. This is an 1863 copy of the Atlantic Monthly, and this is the first issue or the first publication of the story Man Without a Country, which is, I think, why Plumb hung on to this, because that's a very significant story as far as the Civil War. And there's actually certain parts of it that are underlined, and he's left notes. But what's really cool is if you look at a picture of this magazine, you'll see it kind of has like these Frankenstein-looking stitches across it. And when we talk about their service out west here, one of the things that always comes up is that you're out in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming. I mean, there's nothing. And so the lack of reading material was a real problem. And so if somebody had a book or had a magazine, man, you kept that, you know, and they changed hands a lot, got passed around the regiment, probably with other regiments. And you can really see that by the fact that a magazine, something that most people would probably just toss because it was torn, is actually sewn back together because they wanted to keep it so they could keep reading it. You know, I mean, now if something tears, you know, you toss it or something. But this was very, very precious.
No, that's awesome. Okay, so then the third thing, what's the story behind this?
The box.
Yes.
So this you didn't take a picture of, correct?
No, I didn't.
All right. So this is the box here, and this has really an amazing story. When I was talking earlier about how the house used to be a women's shelter, when the women's shelter closed, they had a liquidation sale of everything in the house, and the box, I will tell you, was not in the house. However, there were some other items there that I wanted to get. You know, I didn't want anything to go to the dump. You know, I asked the museum to go through, take what they wanted, and then when things were going out for sale, you know, I wanted to save as much as I could. And so some dear friends of mine, Rob and Lisa Reeves, who are probably watching, went down to the auction for me and picked up a few things. And I came down to Kansas in October of 2021 to pick up those items. And one of the things we were talking about was this box. And I had been told that an antiques dealer had this and said it was Ellen Plumb's cash box, which Ellen Plumb was Preston Plumb's sister. And she ran a bookstore in Emporia her whole life. She never married. And my friend Rob had been trying to get this box, and the antiques dealer would not sell it. And so when I was down there, that kind of prompted Rob to say, you know, well, I'll ask again, maybe he'll sell it. And I remember, you know, him telling me, yeah, the guy's not going to sell, you know. And not too long after that, Rob came home from work, and there was a box on his front step. And inside that box was this box with no letter, no bill, no nothing. And they sent me pictures of it. And what's very cool, which I don't know if you can see, on the side, it says C.S. Plumb, which is for Carrie Southwick Plumb. So this wasn't Ellen's box. It was actually Plumb's wife, Carrie's box. And so when I was down in Kansas just this past November, Rob and Lisa were kind enough to give me this box. And so this along with these other items that I just showed you are some of my most treasured possessions. You know, I mean, you spend this much time researching someone in the family, and to have, you know, a little piece of that, you know, means the world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all that is pretty cool artifacts, for sure. So, with the remaining time, I'm going to have to go back because of our audience and honestly my interest in his visit out west here. Mm-hmm. They came out here in '65.
Yes. And
originally, they, I guess, checked in Fort Laramie, and then they were kind of scattered throughout the other forts. And if I remember right, that basically pushed all the troops of the 11th Ohio further west to like Sweetwater and like Atlantic City, or maybe.
Well, so they were brought out here because a number of the 11th Ohio had been discharged. They were mustering out. And so the 11th Kansas were basically sent out to fill that void. And so when they're first sent out, that's in April of '65. Colonel Moonlight is in command of the regiment. He stays at Fort Laramie. And Plumb, now lieutenant colonel, who had been promoted to a full bird colonel but never mustered in at that rank. That happened when they came out here, but that's just a little tidbit. Anyway, Plumb is the one that goes with them. And so he comes out here, I say here, Casper, and he sets up regimental headquarters at Camp Dodge, which was at the base of Casper Mountain. And this has been a big research project of mine.
Right.
From the first story, it was a small tent encampment, to no, this is regimental headquarters. We now know that there were 3 wooden buildings there. There were actually structures there. So it wasn't just tents. We do know, based on Private Bonwell's map, that it moved at least once, probably for grazing. But initially, most of them were there. As they came out on the way from Fort Laramie, they dropped off certain contingents of men at like Deer Creek, Labonte, and then they got here, and then they sent some further west. And at that time, the 11th Kansas was basically in command of the district. So Plumb was at Camp Dodge, but he was also essentially overseeing the 11th Ohio as well. So there's a lot of records of them, requesting supplies or ammunition, and Plumb was the one that handled all of that from Camp Dodge. And then about June 10th, Plumb gets sent to Fort Halleck. So he goes back to Fort Laramie and then goes down south to Fort Halleck.
Which is actually interesting, because Fort Halleck is a random small fort in the middle of nowhere. And it's just interesting that he as a lieutenant colonel, or however you want to say, is sent to Fort Halleck versus, because like in 11th Ohio, you have William Collins, who pretty much stayed at Fort Laramie. And you have him,
which is like what Moonlight did.
Yeah.
And Moonlight had he mustered out earlier. And so Plumb is down at Fort Halleck, and he's given orders to go down there specifically for the overland mail route, overland stage route. So he's also interfacing with Ben Holiday a lot during this time, who owned. And Major Anderson is at Fort Casper, Plattbridge Station at that time, and is basically overseeing the day-to-day of those contingents. So once Plumb goes to Fort Halleck, he's not dealing with the supply lines to Deer Creek anymore. He's more focused on running the mail route from Fort Halleck. And, at the same time, he's trying to get them discharged, because some of the men in the regiment, they signed, a lot of men when they signed up in the Civil War would sign a 3-year enlistment, which some of the 11th Kansas did. A lot of them signed 3 years or duration of the war. And so in their mind, Civil War is over. It ended in April of 1865. So why in the world am I in the middle of nowhere in Dakota Territory in June of 1865? I should be home. And so Plumb was trying to get those men discharged while he was in Fort Laramie, as he was passing down to Fort Halleck, which of course fell on deaf ears. And they all served until, August, September of 65.
So, obviously, one of the famous events that happened in our Casper area is the battles of Plattbridge and Red Buttes. Where was Plumb during that whole
He was
scenario?
at Fort Halleck. So he was at Fort Halleck then. So he was not there at the Battle of Red Buttes.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, then never mind then.
I mean, the 11th Kansas obviously was.
Yeah.
But yeah, Plumb was down at Fort Halleck along with some other companies.
Right.
So, yeah.
Good deal. Okay, so I guess the next thing is try to see what time we have here. We got a few minutes left, about 5 or 6 minutes left. So I guess what do you think your favorite story is of Plumb? And I guess where I want to go is the type of person he is. I mean, you mentioned other stories, and I guess we can mention them here a little bit. It's just being a very good-hearted guy, even being a banker, using his connections to help people, and it is care for the veterans after the war. So I guess tell us a few stories that really show what type of person he really is, and just leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned Plumb and veterans. So, we talk about like military service lots of times as if it exists in a vacuum, and it doesn't. And any veteran will tell you, once you've served with someone, there is no joke about that brothers in arms. You are brothers for life. And for Plumb, that's how it was. So in one instance, I mentioned he was president of the bank in Emporia. And there was one 11th Kansas soldier who had basically mortgaged his cattle to the bank, and I don't want to say inflated the value of those cattle, but basically he told them he had so much money worth of cattle that he didn't really have. And the bank was coming after him for this. Now, Plumb was at that time not president of the bank anymore, but it was through his old bank. He was a U.S. senator, and the president of the bank at that time was this man named Calvin Hood, who was one of Plumb's business partners. He and Hood were involved in a number of businesses together. And the bank went after this guy. And he's actually, taken to court. They're suing him. And so Plumb sent a letter to the court arguing on this man's behalf to basically drop the case. And so that actually happened. And it was kind of a real joke at the time because Plumb had taken the side of one of his former soldiers who he knew had defrauded the bank. There was no doubt about that. But the man was one of his former soldiers, and he was going to take care of him. And so he actually was counter to his own bank and his own business partner in order to save this guy. There's another story of a captain who was not in the 11th Kansas. He was in a completely different regiment. He was a resident of Kansas who had been wrongfully court-martialed. And he had appealed to Plumb and Thomas Ryan, who was their representative at the time from Kansas, to try to get basically reinstated into the Army. And Plumb's personality was such that he would always work on your behalf. People said he was, once he was your friend, he was aggressively your friend. But he did a lot of this behind the scenes. And so if you came to him and asked for help, he'd say, well, I don't know, I'll try, But then as soon as you left, he would do his damnedest to make sure that happened. And so because he tended to give off this perception that, well, I don't know about it, this captain was like, well, I don't know if this is going anywhere. So he actually went to Washington, D.C., met with Ryan, and he said, I think I'm going to go home. I give up. I don't think this is going anywhere. Plumb doesn't act like it's really getting resolved. And so Ryan says, well, sometimes that's Plumb's way. I'll go talk to him. Don't leave town. Stay here. I'll go talk to Plumb. So Ryan shows up at Plumb's Senate office and says, I think this whole issue with Captain's court-martial is dragging on, a bit. And Plumb said, so it does. Let's go see the president. And so put on his hat, his coat, went out the door, went straight to the White House and just walked right in, see the president who was in a meeting, didn't matter. Plumb just then, according to Ryan, just laid out, I think the words he used was sulfurous criticism on the War Department and the wrongs that this captain had suffered, kind of went off on a tirade. And by the end of the day, all of the paperwork had been done to get the captain reinstated. If he was going to help you, he would help you. There were a number of soldiers who were down on their luck. He would send them money. Sometimes it was anonymous. They didn't even know who it was coming from. He would help them keep their homesteads. A lot of them needed help with their pensions. Not so much different than the VA today. It is difficult to get things through the VA. They would write to their senators and ask for help to get a pension request through. And when he died, there's records that there were about 6,000 active pension cases that he had pushed through. One of the pensions he did was for this gal, his sister Ellen had a bookstore, and this lady that worked for his sister at the bookstore, her brother had been killed in the war. And so her mother was going blind and they needed this pension. And he was the one that pushed that through. And there's a story where he was in Emporia and was helping his sister stock books on the shelves. So here's this U.S. senator, and he's in town stocking shelves in the bookstore, to help his sister out. And this lady and her mother came in and basically broke down into tears, thanking him for getting that pension. And I should also mention, too, that appreciation for veterans went both ways. At one point, when he was in the Senate, Major Anderson, long since out of the military, organized a surprise reunion of members of the 11th Kansas for Plumb at the train station. And so he got off the train and, in typical fashion, kind of put his head down and was, making a beeline to wherever he was going. And as he's doing that, he's noticing he's walking against all of these blue uniforms. And then he looks up and he recognizes his regiment, and he just broke down in tears. He thought the world of his soldiers, and they thought the world of him. It went both ways. And just a, tremendous amount of respect between them all.
No, it's like I said, those stories are amazing. What he does, or what he did for those veterans, and the guy seems like an amazing individual.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's opinion of him was that he was a stand-up character. I don't know how we are on time, but I've got one short story.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So his wife Carrie was chronically ill. And I don't know exactly what she had. Nobody ever said. I suspect she might have had an autoimmune condition, which would not have been known then, but she spent a lot of time bedridden. And he found out that Senator Barry of Arkansas, that his daughter had a similar condition. And so Plumb went to visit Barry. Now, I should also mention, Arkansas, these are different parties, and he goes to visit Senator Barry, talks to him about what his daughter's suffering. He says, gosh, that's a lot like what my wife had. And she got a lot better by seeing this doctor in New York. You should send your daughter there. And Barry says, well, gosh, I'd like to, but we've already tried all these other cures and, it didn't work. And that would be really expensive. And then Plumb says, you can draw on me $1,000, which in today's money is about $25,000. I will never ask for it back. If you can pay me, great. If you never pay me, that's fine. I will never mention it. I will never bring it up ever again. But get your daughter to the doctor. And so Barry said, well, if it means that much to you, I'll find the money to send her there. And so he did. And his daughter got better. And he said, after Plumb had died, he said, not once on any issue ever in the Senate about anything did Plumb ever mention, hey, remember that time, I was going to give you money for your daughter. You want to vote this way on a bill? Never mention it again. Just, he wanted to help Barry's daughter. And those are senators from two different parties.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. No, I guess so. It's 4 past, so we're out of time, unfortunately. It's amazing how, at least from my perspective, how quick an hour goes. But guys, I just want to reiterate, number one, thanks, Joanna, for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. And after that, then I just want to reiterate, guys, so the book is called The Forgotten Senator, The Life and Character. I love that, the character.
I struggled with that because I was like, it's not just his life, it's his personality. Because that's what comes through in a lot of these stories, the heart in it, who he was as a human being. That's what I wanted to get across.
Exactly. So again, it's The Forgotten Senator, Life and Character of Preston B. Plumb from Kansas by Joanna Wickman. And you can go to PrestonPlumb.com and order that book. So Joanna, I appreciate it. I don't think there are any questions. Those of you who are on the live stream, thank you very much. We appreciate you guys for joining. Please share this. This will be live, or not live. This will be available on our YouTube channel after we close out, obviously. But definitely go to PrestonPlumb.com and order Joanna's book. So thanks, Joanna.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Have a good one.